Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how deeply we try to forget. Dr. Elise Warren had spent her entire adult life building walls between herself and the shadows of her childhood. She thought veterinary work in the quiet town of Millbrook would keep her safe from old ghosts. But when a rescued horse named Jasper wouldn't stop shaking his head, what fell from his ear changed everything. It was small, metallic, and bore an engraved symbol she hadn't seen in 20 years. The same symbol from her uncle's horse farm, the one that closed abruptly after a teenage jockey disappeared without a trace. As Elise held the impossible object in her trembling hands, she knew her carefully constructed piece was about to crumble. The family secrets she'd never been told were finally surfacing. What had really happened at Warren's stables all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other in Millbrook, with the familiar rhythm that had defined Dr. Elise Warren's life for the past 15 years. At 38, she had carved out exactly the kind of existence she'd always craved: predictable, peaceful, and mercifully free from the chaos that had marked her younger years. The Warren Animal Clinic sat on the edge of town where the suburbs gave way to rolling farmland. A converted Victorian house that she bought with her first real paycheck and slowly transformed into something that felt like home. The waiting room still carried the scent of lemon oil from yesterday's cleaning, mixing with the familiar antiseptic smell that clung to every veterinary practice. Elise had chosen warm colors for the walls, soft blues and gentle greens that seemed to calm even the most anxious pet owners. Framed photographs of grateful patients lined the hallway. Mrs. Henderson's arthritic golden retriever, the Kowalski, family's rescued tabby cat, and dozens of others whose trust she'd earned one careful examination at a time. Her assistant, Maria Santos, was already brewing coffee when Elise arrived at 7:30, her dark hair pulled back in its usual practical ponytail. At 26, Maria possessed the kind of easy competence that made everything run smoothly, handling scheduling and worried pet owners with equal grace. "Morning, Doc," Maria called from behind the reception desk. "We've got the usual lineup today. Mrs. Peterson's bringing in her poodle for shots. The Brennan farm has 3 cattle ready for pregnancy checks, and that new rescue horse from Sunset Farm is coming in at 10. Elise paused in hanging up her jacket, something flickering in her memory at the mention of horses. She'd grown up around them, back when such things mattered, but these days she mostly treated dogs, cats, and the occasional farm animal. Horses were less common in her practice now, which suited her fine. They carried too many echoes of a time she preferred not to remember. "The rescue horse? What's the issue?" she asked, settling into the familiar routine of reviewing the days. Appointments. Maria consulted her notes. "Owner says the animal won't stop shaking his head. Been going on for about a week now. They're worried about an ear infection, or maybe something stuck inside." Simple enough. Elise nodded and moved into her office, a space she designed for comfort rather than efficiency. The desk was an antique oak piece she'd found at an estate sale, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Photographs of her parents sat in simple frames, her mother's gentle smile, her father's strong hands that had taught her to be gentle with frightened animals. They'd been gone for 8 years now, victims of a late-night drunk driver on Highway 9, and the clinic had become both memorial and sanctuary. What the photographs didn't show, what Elise had carefully excluded from this carefully constructed life, was any trace of her extended family. No pictures of Uncle Thomas, no mementos from Warren stables, nothing that might connect her current existence to the years before she turned 18 and left for college. Determined never to look back, the morning appointments passed in their usual rhythm. Mrs. Peterson's poodle, Duchess, submitted to her vaccinations with regal dignity while her owner fretted over every imagined side effect. The Brennan cattle were healthy and properly pregnant, their massive forms surprisingly gentle. Under Elise's examination, she found peace in these interactions, in the straightforward nature of animal medicine, where problems had solutions and trust was earned through competence and kindness. By 9:45, she was reviewing charts when Maria knocked on her office door. "The horse owner is here early," Maria said. "Sarah Chun from Sunset Farm. She seems pretty worried about Jasper. That's the horse's name." Elise looked up from her paperwork. Sarah Chun ran one of the newer rescue operations in the county, taking in animals that others had given up on. Elise respected that kind of commitment, understood the drive to save things that might otherwise be lost. "Send them around back to the large animal area," Elise said, grabbing her stethoscope and the portable examination kit she kept for bigger patients. "I'll meet them there." The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and Elise breathed deeply as she walked around the building to where her truck was parked. The large animal setup was simpler than her indoor facilities, a covered area with good lighting and sturdy posts for restrained patients who might be less than cooperative. Sarah Chun was waiting beside a horse trailer, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of years working with animals. Beside the trailer stood a chestnut thoroughbred, clearly agitated, his head moving in the persistent shaking motion that had brought him here. "Dr. Warren, I'm Sarah. This is Jasper." Sarah's voice carried the tension of someone who'd run out of other options. "I've tried everything I can think of, but he just won't stop. It's been getting worse." Elise approached slowly, letting Jasper see and smell her before making any sudden movements. The horse was beautiful despite his distress, with the lean build and intelligent eyes that marked quality breeding. But there was something in his expression, a kind of desperate discomfort that went beyond simple irritation. "How long have you had him?" Elise asked, running her hands along Jasper's neck, feeling the tension in his muscles. "About 2 months. He came from an estate sale down in Riverside County. Previous owner died, and the family just wanted to get rid of the animals quickly." Sarah's face darkened. "He was in pretty rough shape when I got him. Underweight, nervous around people, but he's been improving until this started." Elise nodded, continuing her preliminary examination. Jasper's coat was healthy now, his weight good, but the constant head shaking was clearly exhausting him. She could see the strain in his eyes, the way he kept pressing his right ear against his shoulder as if trying to dislodge something. "Let's get him secured and take a proper look," she said, guiding Jasper to the examination area. The horse submitted to the restraints with the resigned patience of an animal who'd learned not to fight human intentions. Elise gathered her equipment: otoscope, tweezers, antiseptic, and prepared for what she assumed would be a routine examination. "Any history on his previous care?" she asked, checking Jasper's left ear first. It was clean, healthy, with no signs of infection or foreign objects. "Not much." The family said he'd been with the old man for about 5 years, but they didn't know anything about his background before that. A state lawyer mentioned something about the owner being involved with horses most of his life, but you know how these things go. People want to get through the paperwork and move on. Elise switched to the right ear, the one Jasper kept favoring. At first glance, it looked similar to the left. No obvious signs of infection, no visible foreign objects. But as she adjusted the otoscope's light and looked deeper, something caught her attention. "There's definitely something in there," she murmured, reaching for her longest tweezers. "It's lodged pretty deep, which explains why the shaking hasn't dislodged it." Sarah stepped closer, worry evident in her expression. "What is it?" "Nothing dangerous, I hope. Hard to tell yet. Could be a seed, maybe a small stone. Sometimes animals get curious and end up with things where they shouldn't be." Elise positioned the tweezers carefully, working by feel as much as sight. The object was wedged tightly, and she had to be careful not to push it deeper or damage Jasper's ear canal. The horse trembled slightly but remained still, as if sensing that help was finally at hand. Elise felt the tweezers make contact with something hard and smooth, and she began the delicate process of working it loose. "Almost got it," she said, concentrating on maintaining her grip while gently maneuvering the object toward the surface. "It's small, but it's really wedged in there." With a final careful twist, the object came free, and Elise immediately understood why Jasper had been in such distress. What she held in her tweezers wasn't a seed or a stone, but something that made her blood run cold. It was a small piece of metal, roughly cylindrical, about the size of a pencil eraser. But it was the design etched into its surface that made Elise's hands begin to shake. Even after 20 years, she recognized the symbol immediately, a stylized horse's head surrounded by intertwined laurel branches, with the initials, W's, carved beneath. Warren Stables. The same logo that had been on everything at her uncle's farm, from the letterhead to the feed buckets to the sign that had hung over the main gate until the day it all ended. The day after Danny Morrison, a 17-year-old jockey with dreams of racing glory, had simply vanished without a trace. "Dr. Warren?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Elise forced herself to breathe, to focus on the present moment rather than the flood of memories threatening to overwhelm her. She couldn't let Sarah see how much this discovery had shaken her, couldn't reveal that this small piece of metal represented everything she'd spent her adult life trying to forget. "It's just unusual," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Not the kind of thing you typically find in an animal's ear. But even as she spoke, Elise knew this was more than unusual. This was impossible. Warren Stables had been closed for 20 years, its buildings demolished, its equipment sold or destroyed. She'd made sure of that, had watched from her college dorm room as the last traces of her uncle's empire were erased from the landscape. Yet here was proof that some things, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing when least expected. As she stood there in the October morning light, holding a piece of her past that should no longer exist, Elise realized that the quiet life she built was about to come to an end. The question wasn't just what this object was doing in Jasper's ear. The question was what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered, and whether she was strong enough to face them. She looked at Jasper, who had finally stopped shaking his head and was standing peacefully in the morning sun, and wondered what other memories he might be carrying, what other pieces of the past were hidden in places she'd never thought to look. Sarah was still watching her with concern, and Elise knew she needed to provide some kind of explanation that wouldn't raise more questions than it answered. "I'll need to run some tests on this," she said, slipping the metal fragment into a specimen bag. "Make sure there's no infection risk or anything else we need to worry about." It wasn't quite a lie. She did need to examine the object more closely, but not for medical reasons. She needed to understand how a piece of Warren Stables had ended up inside a horse that supposedly came from Riverside County. She needed to know if this was an isolated incident or if there were other connections. She'd messed up most of all. She needed to decide whether she was ready to open doors she'd spent 20 years keeping firmly closed. That evening, Elise sat in her home office with the metal fragment under a magnifying lamp, studying every detail of the object that had shattered her carefully constructed piece. The house felt different now, as if the discovery had somehow changed the very air she breathed. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and she found herself jumping at sounds that had never bothered her before. The fragment was even more disturbing. Under magnification, the Warren Stables logo was etched with professional precision, but there were other markings she hadn't noticed initially, tiny numbers along the edge that looked like a date. July 15th, 04. July 15th, 2004. 3 days before Danny Morrison disappeared, she'd kept every newspaper clipping from that summer, though she told herself it was merely curiosity rather than obsession. Now she pulled out the folder she'd hidden behind her veterinary journals, its contents as familiar as a scar that never quite faded. Local teen vanishes from horse farm. Read the headline from the Millbrook Gazette, dated July 18, 2004. Below. Danny's photograph smiled back at her 17 years old, eager, with the lean build of a natural rider and eyes that held nothing but optimism about his future. The article was brief, frustratingly so. Danny Morrison, a summer intern at Warren Stables, had failed to return to his boarding house on the evening of July 17th. His motorcycle was found parked in its usual spot behind the stable's main building. His helmet and riding gear were in his locker, but Danny himself had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. What the newspaper didn't mention, what Elise had learned only through overheard conversations and the kind of gossip that spreads through small towns like wildfire, was that Danny had been asking questions in the weeks before his disappearance. Questions about horses that arrived at Warren Stables with no documentation, about midnight shipments that Uncle Thomas handled personally, about why certain areas of the farm were off limits to everyone except her uncle and his most trusted employees. The official investigation had lasted 6 weeks. State police combed through every inch of the property, interviewed dozens of people, and found exactly nothing. No evidence of foul play, no indication of where Danny might have gone. No reason why a young man on the verge of starting his racing career would simply walk away from everything he'd worked for by September. The case had been quietly shelved. By October, Warren Stables was permanently closed. Uncle Thomas claimed it was due to financial difficulties, but Elise had seen the fear in his eyes during those final weeks, had watched him become increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. He died 5 years later from a heart attack, taking whatever secrets he'd carried to his grave. Or so Elise had believed. Now, staring at the fragment that shouldn't exist, she wondered what else Uncle Thomas might have left behind. What other traces of Warren Stables were still out there, waiting to surface in the most unexpected places. Her laptop sat open beside the newspaper clippings, its screen glowing in the dim light of her office. She'd been researching Jasper's background for the past 2 hours, following every lead she could find about his previous owner and the estate sale where Sarah had acquired him. The trail led to one Marcus Reeves, age 73, who died of complications from diabetes 3 months ago. According to his obituary, Reeves had been involved in the horse industry for most of his adult life, working as everything from a trainer to a bloodstock agent. But there was no mention of any connection to Warren Stables or the Millbrook area. Still, the coincidences were adding up in ways that made Elise's skin crawl. A mysterious metal fragment with the Warren Stables logo, dated from the week Danny Morrison disappeared, found inside a horse owned by a man with decades of experience in the racing industry. It felt less like chance and more like a message, but from whom and why now? Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed her friend Janet Morrison, Danny's older sister, who'd moved to Millbrook 5 years ago when her husband took a job at the county hospital. They'd become close friends despite the shadow of Danny's disappearance that hung between them, or perhaps because of it. Janet was one of the few people who understood the weight of unanswered questions. "Elise, I hope I'm not calling too late." Janet's voice carried the tired edge that appeared whenever anything reminded her of her missing brother. "Not at all. What's going on?" "This might sound strange, but I got a call this afternoon from someone who said they had information about Danny." A man with a gravelly voice wouldn't give his name. "He just said that if I wanted to know what really happened to my brother, I should talk to you about what you found today." Elise felt ice water running through her veins. "Janet, I don't know what you're talking about." He specifically mentioned a horse. Elise said you'd know what that meant. Janet's voice grew more insistent. "What's going on? What did you find?" The careful walls Elise had built around her past began to crumble. She'd never told Janet about her connection to Warren stables, had never revealed that Uncle Thomas was her mother's brother, or that she'd spent several summers working at the farm before everything went wrong. And it seemed kinder to let Janet believe their friendship was pure coincidence rather than the result of shared tragedy. But now, with someone out there who clearly knew both about the metal fragment and about Janet's connection to Danny, keeping secrets was no longer an option. "Janet, I need you to come over. Tonight. There are things I should have told you years ago, and I think someone wants us to know the truth about what happened to Danny." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Elise could practically hear Janet's mind racing through the implications. "You know something," Janet said finally. "You've known something all this time. Not everything, maybe not anything important. But yes, there are things I never told you. Things I thought were better left buried. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead, and Elise sat in her office surrounded by the evidence of secrets that refused to stay hidden. The metal fragment gleamed under the lamp, its surface scratched and worn, but its message clear. Someone had deliberately placed it where she would find it, had orchestrated this entire revelation with surgical precision. But why? And why now, after 20 years of silence? She thought about the anonymous caller who'd contacted Janet, the way he'd known exactly when and where to apply pressure. This wasn't random chance or coincidence. This was someone with intimate knowledge of both the past and the present. Someone who'd been watching and waiting for the right moment to set events in motion. As she prepared to finally tell Janet the truth about her connection to Warren stables, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that she was being manipulated, that each step she took was exactly what someone wanted her to do. But the alternative, ignoring the evidence, pretending the fragment didn't exist, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd once believed in. 20 years ago, she'd been too young and too frightened to seek the truth about Danny's disappearance. Now she had the skills, the resources, and the determination to follow wherever the evidence led, even if it meant confronting the darkest secrets of her family's past, even if it meant discovering that the uncle she'd loved and trusted had been capable of things she'd never imagined. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with increased intensity, and Elise wondered if it was carrying the whispers of old ghosts who'd finally found their voices. Janet arrived exactly 20 minutes later, her face pale but determined in the porch light. She'd thrown on a jacket over her hospital scrubs, and Elise realized she must have been working the evening shift when the mysterious call came through. "Start." "From the beginning," Janet said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Elise's desk. Her eyes immediately fixed on the newspaper clippings spread across the surface. "And don't leave anything out this time." Elise took a deep breath, knowing that once she began this conversation, there would be no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained around the subject of Danny's disappearance. "My mother's maiden name was Warren," she began. "Thomas. Warren, who owned Warren Stables, was my uncle. Her older brother." Janet's expression didn't change, but Elise saw her hands tighten on the arms of her chair. "I spent several summers working at the farm when I was in high school. Uncle Thomas he seemed like a good man. Respected in the community, successful, generous with his time and money. I looked up to him. But," Janet's voice was carefully controlled, "there were things that didn't add up. Horses that arrived without papers, sometimes in the middle of the night. Areas of the farm that were off limits to everyone except Uncle Thomas and a few of his most trusted employees. Questions that got deflected or ignored when anyone asked about certain aspects of the operation." Elise reached for the metal fragment, holding it up so Janet could see the Warren Stables logo clearly. "I found this inside Jasper's ear this morning. A horse that supposedly came from an estate sale in Riverside County, but this fragment is dated 3 days before Danny disappeared. Janet leaned forward, studying the object with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting 20 years for any clue about her brother's fate. "You think this is connected to Danny? That Uncle Thomas, your uncle, had something to do with what happened to him?" "I don't know, but someone wants us to think so. Someone who knows enough about both of us to orchestrate today's discovery. Someone who has access to your phone number and enough information to time the call perfectly." Janet was quiet for several minutes, processing the revelation that her friend had been connected to the case all along. When she finally spoke, her voice held a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years, why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was 18 when it happened, and I was scared. Because after Danny vanished, Uncle Thomas changed. He became paranoid, suspicious of everyone. He closed the farm and sold everything, but he never talked about why. And because..." Elise hesitated, then decided Janet deserved the complete truth. "Because I was afraid you'd blame me for not speaking up sooner. What did you know? At the time, I mean, very little. I'd noticed the strange shipments, the restricted areas, but I was just a teenager working summers for spending money. I didn't think it was my place to ask questions. And honestly, I didn't want to believe Uncle Thomas could be involved in anything illegal or dangerous." Janet picked up one of the newspaper clippings, staring at Danny's photograph with the expression of someone reliving old grief. Danny was asking questions, she said quietly. In the letters he sent home that summer, he mentioned things that didn't make sense to him. Horses being moved at strange hours, conversations that stopped when he walked into a room, paperwork that didn't match what he was seeing with his own eyes. He was suspicious of something, more curious than suspicious. You know how Danny was, he couldn't let a mystery go unsolved. If he saw something that didn't add up, he'd keep poking at it until he found answers. Janet's voice broke slightly. "Maybe that's what got him killed." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications they'd both avoided for years. Killed. Not missing, not vanished, but dead murdered because he'd learned something he shouldn't have known. "There's something else," Elise said, pulling out a folder she'd retrieved from her filing cabinet. "I've been researching Marcus Reeves, the man who owned Jasper before he died. Look at this." She handed Janet a printout from an online bloodstock directory. Dated 2003, Marcus Reeves was listed as a bloodstock agent specializing in private transactions and discreet acquisitions. His business address was in Riverside County, but according to the directory, he frequently worked with clients throughout California, including several facilities in the Millbrook area. "He could have known Uncle Thomas," Janet said, scanning the document. "Could have been involved in whatever illegal operation was running through Warren's stables. Could have been covering for him all these years. Or could have been the one orchestrating everything from the beginning." Elise felt a chill as the implications became clear. What if Uncle Thomas wasn't the mastermind? What if he was just the front man, and someone like Reeves was pulling the strings? Janet set down the printout and looked directly at Elise. "What if Reeves isn't really dead?" The question hit Elise like a physical blow. She'd assumed that Marcus Reeves' obituary was legitimate, that his death from diabetes complications was genuine. But what if it had been staged? What if someone with enough resources and connections had faked his death to escape scrutiny, only to emerge 20 years later with a message delivered through the most unlikely messenger imaginable? "We need to verify the death certificate," Elise said, "and we need to trace Jasper's movements more carefully. If Reeves isn't dead, if he orchestrated this entire discovery, then he wants something from us," Janet finished. "The question is what?" They sat in silence, both contemplating the possibility that they were dealing with someone who'd spent 2 decades planning this moment. Someone with the patience and resources to fake his own death, manipulate an estate sale, and ensure that A specific horse ended up in the care of someone who would bring it to Elise Warren for treatment. It was an elaborate setup, almost impossibly complex. But it was the only explanation that made sense of all the coincidences. "Janet," Elise said carefully, "if we pursue this, if we start digging into what really happened 20 years ago, we might not like what we find. About Danny, about Uncle Thomas, about all of it." Janet's response was immediate and firm. "I've spent 20 years not knowing. I've built a life around that empty space where my brother should be, and I've made peace with the uncertainty. But if there's a chance, any chance of finally learning the truth, I have to take it." She reached across the desk and took Elise's hand. "Besides, I don't think we have a choice anymore. Whoever's behind this has made sure of that. They've drawn us into their game, whether we like it or not." As if to emphasize Janet's point, Elise's phone rang again. The display showed unknown number, and both women stared at it with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "Answer it," Janet said. Elise picked up the phone, putting it on speaker so they could both hear. "Dr. Warren," the same gravelly voice from Janet's earlier call. "I trust you've had time to discuss things with Miss Morrison." "What do you want?" Elise asked. "Justice, truth. The same things you want, I suspect." A pause. "Meet me tomorrow night at the old Warren stable site. Midnight. Come alone, both of you, and bring the fragment." The line went dead, leaving them staring at each other in the sudden silence. The game, whatever it was, had begun. The next day passed in a haze of routine veterinary work that felt surreal against the backdrop of the previous evening's revelations. Elise found herself going through the motions, examining a German shepherd with hip dysplasia, vaccinating a litter of kittens, discussing treatment options with worried pet owners, while her mind remained fixed on the midnight meeting that awaited them. Janet had taken the day off from the hospital, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. They'd spent the morning researching everything they could find about Marcus Reeves, the estate sale where Sarah had acquired Jasper, and the current status of the land that had once been Warren stables. What they discovered only deepened its ease. Mystery. Marcus Reeves' death certificate appeared legitimate, filed with Riverside County 3 months ago. But the details of his estate sale were troubling. According to the records, Reeves had owned over a dozen horses at the time of his death, all of which had been sold quickly and without the usual pre-sale veterinary examinations that were standard in the industry. More disturbing was the fact that several of the horses had been purchased by buyers whose names led nowhere, shell companies with no operational history, post office box addresses that didn't correspond to any actual facilities. It's like someone was deliberately scattering the horses to make them impossible to track, Janet observed, reviewing the sale records for the 3rd time. "But why?" "Because they all carry evidence," Elise replied, studying a map of the old Warren stables property on her laptop screen. "If Reeves was involved in whatever Uncle Thomas was doing 20 years ago, and if he's been hiding horses with embedded artifacts all this time, then each horse is like a time capsule, a piece of evidence that could expose the whole operation." Janet leaned back in her chair, the weight of possibility settling over both of them. "The question is whether we're walking into a trap tonight or finally getting the answers we've been looking for." The Warren Stables property had been sold to a development company in 2006, 2 years after Uncle Thomas's death. But the planned subdivision had never been built due to complications with soil testing and environmental concerns. The land now sat empty, overgrown with weeds and marked only by the concrete foundations where the main buildings had once stood. Elise remembered the place in its prime neat paddocks, well-maintained barns, the main house where Uncle Thomas had lived alone after his wife died in a car accident in 1998. It had been a beautiful operation, the kind of facility that attracted visitors from across the state and gave the impression of old money respectability. Now it would be nothing but Shadows and memories, the perfect setting for whatever confrontation awaited them. "We should tell someone where we're going," Janet said as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. "Just in case." "Who? The police?" "And tell them what, that we're meeting an anonymous caller who may or may not be a dead man, based on evidence we found inside a horse's ear?" Elise shook her head. "They'd think we've lost our minds. Maybe we have." But even as she said it, Janet was checking her purse to make sure she had her phone, pepper spray, and the small flashlight she'd brought from home. They were both scared, but neither was willing to walk away from the possibility of finally learning what had happened to Danny Dot as evening approached. They drove separately to the old Warren Stables property, taking different routes to avoid drawing attention. The development company had installed a gate years ago, but it had long since been broken by vandals and curiosity seekers. Warning signs about trespassing dotted the fence line, but they were faded and largely ignored. Elise parked her truck on a side road half a mile away and walked through the darkness, following a path she remembered from her teenage years. The October night was cold and clear, with enough moonlight to make out the general layout of the abandoned property, but not enough to reveal details. Janet was already waiting near what had been the main barn, a tall figure silhouetted against the concrete foundation. She turned as Elise approached, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. "Any sign of our mysterious caller?" Elise asked, checking her watch. It was 11:55 p.m. "Not yet, but I keep feeling like we're being watched." Elise understood what she meant. The empty property felt alive with attention, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every movement. It was probably just nerves and the natural eeriness of an abandoned place, but it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. At exactly midnight, a figure emerged from the shadows near where the main house had once stood. He was tall and thin, probably in his 70s, with white hair and a face weathered by decades of sun and wind. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, and carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd once held significant power. "Dr. Warren, Miss Morrison." His voice was the same gravelly tone they'd heard on the phone, but seeing him in person added weight to his words. "Thank you for coming. Are you Marcus Reeves?" Elise asked directly. The man smiled, an expression that held no warmth. "Marcus Reeves died 3 months ago, just as the records indicate. I merely borrowed his identity for as long as it was useful." He gestured toward the concrete slab where they stood. "My real name is William Cross. I was Thomas Warren's business partner for 15 years. The name meant nothing to Elise, but she saw recognition flash across Janet's face. "You were mentioned in the police reports," Janet said. "Danny wrote about you in one of his letters. Said you made him nervous. Your brother was a perceptive young man. Too perceptive for his own good." Cross reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. Janet clutched the envelope against her chest, as if it contained Danny himself rather than just evidence of his fate. Cross had shown them the burial site, a small depression near a cluster of oak trees where the ground had settled over the years, and promised to provide GPS coordinates to the authorities once they decided how to proceed. Now, an hour later, they sat in Elise's truck in the parking lot of an all-night diner, the engine running for warmth, but neither of them ready to go inside where bright lights and normal conversation would force them to process what they'd learned. 20 years, Janet whispered, staring out at the empty road. 20 years I've been hoping he ran away to start a new life somewhere. That maybe he was happy, even if I never saw him again." Elise wanted to offer comfort, but what comfort was there? Danny Morrison hadn't escaped to pursue his dreams. He'd been murdered by a man Elise had loved and trusted, buried like a secret that was never meant to surface. "I keep thinking about the summers I spent at the farm after Danny disappeared," Elise said. "Uncle Thomas was different, more distant. But I thought it was grief over the business failure. I never suspected. I never imagined he could be capable of. You were 18. You couldn't have known. But I should have seen something. Some sign that he was carrying that kind of guilt. Janet turned to look at her, and in the dashboard light, Elise could see the exhaustion in her friend's eyes. Don't do that to yourself. Don't take responsibility for what Thomas Warren chose to do. Janet's voice grew stronger. We have the truth now. We have evidence. We have Danny's location. The question is what we do with it. They'd opened the envelope in Cross's presence, quickly scanning the contents by flashlight. Bank statements showing large cash deposits followed by legitimate horse sale transactions. Shipping manifests for horses that had no documented breeding or ownership history. Photographs of midnight meetings between Thomas Warren and men in expensive suits who clearly weren't horse enthusiasts. And a handwritten journal in Danny's familiar scrawl, documenting everything he'd observed and suspected during his final weeks at Warren stables. We have to go to the police, Elise said. Though the thought filled her with dread, Cross was right about one thing. There are other people involved in this, other victims who deserve justice. The statute of limitations on money laundering might have expired, Janet pointed out. And Cross is dying anyway. If we expose this, we might not get the justice we're hoping for. But we'll get the truth, and Danny will finally be found. He'll finally come home. The words hung between them, heavy with implications. Exposing the truth would mean Danny's remains could be recovered and properly buried. It would mean Janet could finally have closure, could visit a grave instead of wondering endlessly about what had happened to her brother. But it would also mean destroying the memory of Thomas Warren, exposing him as a criminal and a murderer. It would mean admitting that Elise had been blind to the true nature of someone she'd considered a father figure. There's something else we need to consider, Janet said quietly. Cross gave us the list of where the other horses were sold. If those animals are still carrying evidence of other crimes, other victims, we have an obligation to find them. Even if it's dangerous? Cross implied there were powerful people involved in the money laundering operation, people who might not appreciate having their past crimes exposed. Elise thought about the list of names and locations Cross had provided. 12 horses scattered across 3 states, each potentially carrying artifacts that could expose decades of criminal activity. It would be a massive undertaking, requiring careful planning and probably some degree of personal risk, but it was also an opportunity to honor Danny's memory by completing the investigation he died trying to pursue. We start with the closest ones, she said. See what we can find before we make any decisions about involving law enforcement. Janet nodded slowly, then pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the contact list. What are you doing? Calling my supervisor at the hospital. I'm going to request extended family leave. Janet's finger hovered over the call button. This is going to take more than a few days, and I want to see it through to the end. Janet, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Danny was my brother, and for 20 years I've been powerless to help him. Now I finally have a chance to get him justice, to find the truth he died trying to expose. I'm not walking away from that. As Janet made her call, Elise studied the list of horses and their current locations. The nearest was in Sacramento, about 4 hours away, a mare named Midnight's Promise, who'd been purchased by someone named Jennifer Walsh. According to Cross's notes, Walsh ran a small therapeutic riding program for disabled children. The irony wasn't lost on Elise. Horses that had been used to launder money from criminal enterprises were now being used to help heal damaged lives. But if Midnight's Promise carried evidence similar to what they'd found in Jasper, they would need to find a way to examine the animal without arousing suspicion. Family leave approved, Janet announced, ending her call. I've got 3 weeks. And my supervisor doesn't ask questions when I tell her it's about Danny. The first horse is in Sacramento. We could drive up tomorrow, see if we can arrange to examine her under the pretense of a routine health check. And if we find another artifact, then we keep looking. We follow the trail wherever it leads, and we document everything we find. When we're ready, when we have enough evidence to ensure justice is served, we go to the authorities." Janet was quiet for several minutes, processing the commitment they were about to make. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about exposing a network of criminals who had operated with impunity for decades. "There's something Cross said that bothers me," she finally admitted, "about the other people involved in the money laundering operation. He made it sound like some of them are still active, still powerful enough to be dangerous. You think we're putting ourselves at risk by pursuing this? I think we already put ourselves at risk the moment we answered his phone call. But I also think Danny deserves better than being left buried in an unmarked grave while his killers escape consequences." Elise started the truck and began driving toward Janet's house, both of them lost in thought about the journey they were about to undertake. In a rearview mirror, she noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be following at a consistent distance. When she turned left at the next intersection, the sedan turned as well. When she turned right 2 blocks later, it followed again. "Janet," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm her friend but needing to share her suspicion, "I think someone's following us." Janet turned in her seat to look back, and Elise saw her face go pale in the passing streetlights. "How long have they been there?" "Since we left the diner." "Maybe longer." "Do you think Cross set us up? Fed us information and then sent someone to make sure we don't use it?" "I don't know. But we're about to find out." The dark sedan continued, following them through the empty streets of Millbrook, maintaining its distance but making no attempt to conceal its presence. Whoever was driving wanted them to know they were being watched. The game Cross had started was apparently far from over. The dark sedan followed them for 6 more blocks before suddenly turning down a side street and disappearing into the night. Elise and Janet sat in her driveway for 20 minutes, watching for any sign of surveillance before finally deciding it was safe to go inside. But the message had been delivered clearly. They were being watched, and someone was very interested in what they'd learned from William Cross. "We need to be smarter about this," Janet said, as they settled in her living room with cups of coffee neither of them really wanted. "If we're going to investigate the other horses, we can't just show up and start asking questions." Elise nodded, spreading the list of horse locations across Janet's coffee table. "We need cover stories, legitimate reasons to be examining these animals. And we need to assume that whoever was following us tonight has access to our phones, our credit cards, maybe even our bank accounts." Janet's years as a hospital administrator had taught her to think systematically about security risks. If this money laundering operation was as extensive as Cross suggested, the people involved have resources. They spent the next hour planning their approach to finding the scattered horses. Elise would use her veterinary credentials to arrange examinations, claiming to be conducting research on hereditary conditions in thoroughbreds. It was plausible enough to get them access without raising immediate suspicion. But as they worked through the logistics, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Cross had seemed genuinely remorseful about Danny's death, but his willingness to provide evidence after 20 years of silence felt too convenient. "Janet, what if this is a trap?" "What do you mean?" "Cross shows up claiming to want justice, hands us evidence that's been perfectly preserved for 2 decades, and gives us a list of exactly where to find more proof. It feels orchestrated." Janet set down her coffee cup and looked directly at Elise. "You think he's still working with the people who were involved in the money laundering?" "I think Cross is dying, just like he said. But I'm starting to wonder if someone else is pulling the strings. Someone who wants us to find those horses, for reasons that have nothing to do with justice." The thought chilled both of them. If they were being manipulated into exposing the evidence, It could only be because someone wanted to eliminate the last traces of the original operation, including anyone who might possess knowledge about it. "We're the loose ends," Janet said. Quietly. "Cross, the horses, the artifacts, we're all witnesses to crimes that someone thought were safely buried. And by following Cross's trail, we're making ourselves targets." They sat in silence, contemplating the possibility that their search for truth was actually a carefully orchestrated plan to lure them into the open, where they could be permanently silenced. But even knowing the risks, neither was willing to walk away. "We continue, but we do it differently," Elise decided. "No phones, no credit cards, no digital trail that can be followed. We pay cash, use false names, and we document everything in multiple copies. And we don't trust anyone except each other." The next morning, they drove to Sacramento in Janet's car. Having left their phones at home and paying for gas with cash, Janet had withdrawn from 3 different ATMs. The therapeutic riding facility was located on 10 acres outside the city, a modest operation that focused on helping children with physical and developmental disabilities gain confidence through interaction with horses. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 50s with the kind of practical warmth that made her perfect for working with vulnerable children. She welcomed Elise's request to examine Midnight's Promise as part of a hereditary health study, though she seemed puzzled by the focus on ear canal abnormalities. Midnight's never had any problems with her ears, Walsh explained as they walked toward the pasture where the black mare was grazing. "She's been completely healthy since I got her 3 months ago." Midnight's Promise was a beautiful animal, with the elegant lines and intelligent eyes that marked quality breeding. But as Elise approached for the examination, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The mare had a small scar on her right ear, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. A scar that suggested previous surgical intervention. "Has she ever had any veterinary work done on her ears?" Elise asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Not since I've owned her. The previous owner's vet records showed she'd had some kind of minor procedure a few years ago, but nothing recent." Elise proceeded with the examination, using an otoscope to check both ears while Janet watched from nearby. The left ear was clear, but in the right ear canal, she found exactly what she'd feared she would find. Another metal fragment, slightly larger than the one from Jasper, with different markings etched into its surface. This one bore the initials SM, and a date from 2003, a year before Danny's disappearance. But more disturbing were the additional markings, what appeared to be GPS coordinates and a series of numbers that looked like an account number. Elise carefully extracted the fragment while Walsh was distracted by questions from Janet about the writing program. Within minutes, she had the evidence secured in a specimen bag and the examination completed. "Everything looks fine," she told Walsh. "Midnight's Promise is in excellent health." As they drove away from the facility, Janet examined the new artifact under a magnifying glass. "These coordinates, do you think they mark another burial site?" "I think they mark something someone wants very badly to keep hidden." Elise felt a chill as the implications became clear. "And I think we're going to keep finding these artifacts in every horse on Cross's list, leading us deeper into something we may not be prepared to handle. The question is whether we're following a trail toward justice or walking into a trap that's been 20 years in the making." Janet's phone, one of 2 burner phones they'd purchased with cash that morning, buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. 2 down, 10 to go. You're doing exactly what we hoped you would. A friend. They stared at the message, realizing that despite all their precautions, someone was still tracking their movements and apparently applauding their progress. But toward what end, neither of them could say. "We're not investigating this network," Janet said slowly. "We're exposing it for someone else's benefit. The question is whether that someone else wants the same thing we do." justice for Danny or whether they have an entirely different agenda. As they drove toward their next destination, both women realized they were no longer in control of their investigation. They were players in someone else's game, following a script they hadn't written toward a conclusion they couldn't predict. But they were too deep to turn back now, and Danny's ghost deserved better than another 20 years of silence. The burner phone rang as they were driving through the Central Valley toward their third horse location in Fresno. Janet answered warily, putting the call on speaker. "Miss Morrison, Dr. Warren." The voice was different this time, younger, with a slight accent that suggested East Coast origins. "I think it's time we met properly." "Who is this?" Elise demanded. "My name is Agent David Chun, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I've been tracking the Warren Stable's money laundering operation for the past 18 months. Janet and Elise exchanged glances. An FBI agent would explain how their movements were being monitored despite their precautions, but it raised new questions about what they'd stumbled into. "If you're FBI, why haven't you arrested William Cross?" Janet asked. "Because Cross is working for us, has been for the past year, ever since we approached him about cooperating in exchange for immunity." Chun's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to dealing with complex criminal investigations. His cancer diagnosis provided the perfect motivation for him to finally come forward. Elise felt the world shift around her as the implications became clear. Everything he told us about Uncle Thomas and about Danny's murder is true, but it's not the whole truth. Cross was more than just Thomas Warren's business partner. He was the operational head of a money laundering network that processed over $200 million in criminal proceeds over a 15-year period. The number hit them like a physical blow. They'd been thinking in terms of a local operation, a relatively small-scale criminal enterprise. But $200 million suggested something far more extensive and dangerous. "Pull off at the next exit," Chun instructed. "There's a truck stop 2 miles ahead. We need to talk in person, and you need to understand what you've walked into before you get yourselves killed." 20 minutes later, they sat across from Agent David Chun in a booth at the back of a nearly empty diner. He was younger than Elise. As expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he'd been living and breathing this case for months. "The artifacts you've been finding aren't just evidence of past crimes," he explained, sliding a folder across the table. "They're keys to active accounts that are still being used for money laundering. The GPS coordinates point to safe deposit boxes, offshore account access codes, locations where cash and assets are stored." Janet opened the folder and found herself looking at surveillance photographs of men and women in expensive suits, corporate logos she recognized from major financial institutions, and transaction records that showed millions of dollars moving through a complex web of shell companies and foreign banks. The Warren Stables operation was just one node in a network that spans multiple states and several countries. Chun continued. "When Thomas Warren died and Cross went underground, we thought the network had collapsed. But in the past 2 years, we've detected activity suggesting someone has taken over the operation using the same basic structure. And you think the artifacts in the horses are the key to exposing the new operators," Elise said. "We know they are. Each horse carries a piece of the puzzle: account numbers, access codes, geographical locations of assets. Whoever has been running the network since Cross disappeared has been trying to recover these horses for months. Which is why someone was following us last night," Janet realized. "And why you've been receiving those helpful text messages. There are 2 groups trying to find the horses, us and the people who've taken over the network. The difference is that we want to arrest them, and they want to eliminate anyone who might expose their operation." Chun leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Cross approached us because he realized the new operators weren't content with just money laundering. They've branched out into human trafficking, arms dealing, and political corruption. The kind of crimes that carry life sentences or death penalties in some jurisdictions. The scope of what they'd uncovered was overwhelming. What had started as a search for answers about Danny Morrison's disappearance had led them into the middle of an international criminal conspiracy. What happened to Danny? Why was he really killed? Janet asked quietly. Because he didn't just discover the money laundering operation. He discovered that your uncle was being blackmailed into participating. Chun pulled out a photograph of Danny Morrison, but this one wasn't from the newspapers. This showed Danny in conversation with a man Elise didn't recognize, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. Danny had figured out that Thomas Warren wasn't a willing participant in the criminal enterprise. He was being coerced. By whom? By people who had compromising information about his late wife's death. The car accident that killed Thomas's wife in 1998 wasn't an accident. She was murdered because she discovered irregularities in the stables, financial records, and threatened to go to the authorities. The revelation hit Elise like a physical blow. Aunt Margaret, Uncle Thomas's beloved wife, had been murdered, and Uncle Thomas had been forced to participate in criminal activities to keep that murder secret. Danny was trying to gather evidence to expose the blackmail scheme when Thomas killed him. Chun continued. Thomas thought he was protecting himself, but he was actually protecting the people who had murdered his wife and were using her death to control him. So Uncle Thomas wasn't the villain, Janet said slowly. He was another victim. A victim who became a perpetrator when he killed your brother. But yes, the real architects of the operation were always working behind the scenes, using blackmail and coercion to control people like Thomas Warren. Chun handed them another photograph. This one showing a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes. This is Richard Castellanos, the man we believe has been running the network since Cross went underground. He's a legitimate businessman on the surface, owns several investment firms, sits on charity boards, contributes to political campaigns. But we suspect he's been using those legitimate enterprises to launder money from increasingly violent criminal activities. And he's been trying to recover the horses to access the hidden accounts, Elise said, which is why your investigation has put you both in serious danger. Castellanos doesn't leave loose ends, and he has the resources to eliminate threats permanently. Janet studied the photograph, memorizing Castellanos' features. What do you want from us? And don't say you want us to back off and let the FBI handle it, because we're too deep in this now. Chun smiled for the first time since they'd met him. Actually, we want you to continue exactly what you've been doing. But now you'll be doing it with federal backup and protection. We've been trying to get close to Castellanos for months, but he's too careful. Your investigation has forced him to make moves, to expose himself in ways we can exploit. You want to use us as bait, Elise said. We want to use you as partners. You continue following Cross's trail, finding the horses and recovering the artifacts. We provide protection and technical support. And when we have enough evidence, we take down the entire network. Chun slid a business card across the table. Think about it. But don't think too long. Castellanos knows you found the first 2 artifacts, and he's not going to wait indefinitely before deciding you're too dangerous to leave alive. As they sat in the truck stop parking lot after Chun left, Janet and Elise contemplated the choice. They faced. They could walk away now, turn the evidence over to the FBI and hope for the best. Or they could continue their investigation, knowing they were now targets of a criminal organization with international reach and unlimited resources. Danny didn't get a choice, Janet said finally. He stumbled into this investigation and paid for it with his life. But we have a choice. We can finish what he started, or we can let his killers escape justice again. If we do this, if we work with the FBI, there's no guarantee we'll survive to see the end of it. But if we don't do it, Danny's death means nothing. And all of Other victims of this network past and future don't get justice either. Elise started the truck, knowing they'd already made their decision. They would continue following the trail, but now they would be hunting predators who were also hunting them. The question was whether they were skilled enough, lucky enough, or determined enough to survive the confrontation that was coming. Working with the FBI changed everything about their investigation, but not in the ways Elise had expected. Agent Chun provided them with sophisticated surveillance equipment, encrypted communication devices, and a level of tactical support that made their operation feel more like a military mission than a search for answers. But it also meant acknowledging that they were now active participants in a federal investigation that could take months or years to complete, and that every move they made was being watched by both their allies and their enemies. The next 2 weeks passed in a carefully choreographed dance of investigation and counter-surveillance. They visited 6 more horses on Cross's list, finding artifacts in each one that provided additional pieces of the financial puzzle. GPS coordinates led them to safe deposit boxes in 3 different states. Account numbers opened doors to offshore banking records that showed millions of dollars flowing through shell companies across the globe. Each discovery brought them closer to understanding the full scope of the network Richard Castellanos had built using the foundation Thomas Warren and William Cross had established 2 decades earlier. But it also increased the danger they faced, as Castellanos' people became more aggressive in their attempts to intercept the evidence. Twice they'd been followed by teams of professional surveillance operatives. Once their hotel room had been searched while they were out examining a horse in Oregon. And 3 days ago, Jennifer Walsh from the Sacramento Therapeutic Riding Facility had called to report that men in expensive suits had visited her asking questions about veterinarians who'd recently examined her horses. "He's getting desperate," Agent Chun explained during one of their weekly briefings in anonymous hotel rooms. "Our financial crimes team has been able to freeze 17 accounts based on the information you've recovered. That's probably cost Castellanos somewhere between $30 and $50 million in accessible assets. Which means he's going to escalate his response," Janet observed. She'd proven surprisingly adept at understanding criminal psychology. Perhaps because her years of dealing with hospital administrators had taught her to think strategically about institutional behavior. Exactly. Which is why we're accelerating the timeline for the final phase of the operation. Chun spread a map across the hotel room table, marking locations where the remaining 4 horses were believed to be located. "We've been tracking Castellanos' movements for the past week. He's been visiting these locations personally, which suggests he's planning to recover the horses himself rather than sending subordinates. Or he's planning to eliminate the horses so we can't get to the artifacts," Elise said. "Also possible. Which is why we need to reach them first." The 4 remaining horses were scattered across California and Nevada, each one representing a significant risk, but also a crucial piece of the evidence needed to bring down the entire network. The plan Chen outlined was ambitious, simultaneous raids on all 4 locations, coordinated with local law enforcement and designed to recover the artifacts while capturing as many of Castellanos' operatives as possible. "Your role will be to examine the horses and recover the artifacts while our tactical teams handle security," Chun explained. "But you need to understand that once we initiate this operation, there's no going back. Castellanos will know that. We have enough evidence to destroy his network, and he'll respond accordingly." "What kind of response are we talking about?" Janet asked. "The kind that usually ends with witnesses disappearing permanently." The weight of that statement settled over them as they reviewed the operational details. They'd come too far to turn back now, but the risks were escalating beyond anything they'd imagined when this started with a simple veterinary examination. That night, in their secure hotel room, Elise and Janet sat up reviewing everything they'd learned about the network and their own roles in exposing it. The Danny Morrison who disappeared 20 years ago had been trying to protect an innocent man from blackmail. The Danny Morrison they were honoring now was leading them toward a confrontation with international criminals who had no qualms about murder. "Do you think Danny would approve of what we're doing?" Janet asked quietly. "I think Danny would be proud that his death led to something bigger than just solving his own case." Elise stared at the map Chun had left with them, studying the locations where their final confrontations would take place. "But I also think he'd be worried about the risks we're taking." "I'm worried about the risks we're taking, but you're still committed to seeing this through." "Absolutely. But I want you to know that if something happens to me during the operation, if Castellanos' people get to me before the FBI can provide protection, I don't want you to blame yourself." Elise looked at her friend, recognizing the same determination she'd seen in Janet's eyes since the night they'd first learned the truth about Danny's disappearance. "Nothing's going to happen to either of us. We've come this far. We've been this. Careful. We're going to finish what we started and walk away with our lives intact. And if we don't, then we'll have given Danny the justice he deserved. And we'll have prevented other families from going through what you've endured for the past 20 years. The next morning, Agent Chun called with news that changed their timeline dramatically. "We've, intercepted communications indicating that Castellanos is planning to move against all 4 remaining horse locations within the next 48 hours, he said, his voice tense with urgency. "He's not just trying to recover the artifacts anymore. He's planning to eliminate every piece of evidence, including the horses themselves. And anyone who might have examined them," Janet added grimly. "Exactly. Which means we're initiating the operation tomorrow night. All 4 locations simultaneously, starting at 2100 hours. Elise felt her stomach drop. They'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, but the reality of coordinated federal raids happening within 24 hours made everything feel suddenly real and terrifyingly immediate. "What about our safety during the operations?" she asked. "Each location will have a full tactical team providing overwatch. You'll be wearing body armor and communication equipment, and you'll have armed agents within 10 feet of you at all times." Chun paused. "But I won't lie to you, there are no guarantees in an operation this complex. Castellanos has resources, and he's demonstrated a willingness to use violence to protect his interests." That afternoon, they underwent intensive briefings on operational security, emergency procedures, and the tactical equipment they'd be using. The body armor was heavier than Elise had expected, and the communication headset felt strange against her ears. But the weight of the equipment was reassuring in a way, a physical reminder that they weren't facing this danger alone. The 4th horse on their list, a paw stallion named Thunder's Legacy, was being held at a private facility outside Las Vegas. The other 3 were scattered across California, each one representing a potential flashpoint for armed confrontation. "The Las Vegas location is where we expect the heaviest resistance," Chine explained as they reviewed satellite photographs of the facility. "It's owned by a shell company that we've linked directly to Castellanos, and our surveillance indicates the presence of at least 6 armed security personnel." "Why that location specifically?" Janet asked. "Because according to Cross's information, Thunder's Legacy is carrying the master access codes for the network's primary offshore accounts. If Castellanos loses access to those codes, his entire operation collapses overnight. The artifact they were seeking, a set of encrypted access codes that could unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds, represented the culmination of everything they'd been working toward. But it also meant they would be walking into the most dangerous situation of their lives. As evening approached, they met with the tactical teams that would be providing their security. The agents were professional and confident, but Elise could see the tension in their eyes. Everyone understood that tomorrow's operation would likely involve armed confrontation with people who had nothing left to lose. Remember, the tactical team leader told them during the final briefing, "Your job is to examine the horses and recover the artifacts. Our job is to keep you alive while you do it. Don't try to be heroes. Follow our instructions. Stay behind cover when we tell you. T.O. and trust us to handle any threats that emerge." That night, Elise lay awake in the hotel room, listening to Janet's steady breathing and thinking about all the choices that had led them to this moment. A simple veterinary examination had spiraled into an international criminal investigation that would either result in justice for Danny Morrison and dozens of other victims, or in their own deaths at the hands of people who saw them as obstacles to be eliminated. But even knowing the risks, even understanding that tomorrow might be their last day alive, she felt no regret about the path they'd chosen. Danny Morrison had died trying to expose the truth about a criminal conspiracy. If they died tomorrow, it would be while completing the investigation he'd started at 3 in the morning. Her encrypted phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Warren, you have 24 hours to walk away from this investigation. After that, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of Miss Morrison. This is not a threat. It is information you can use to make an informed decision about your future. R. Castellanos." Elise stared at the message, realizing that despite all the FBI security measures, Castellanos still had ways of reaching them directly. The fact that he was offering them a way out suggested he was concerned about tomorrow's operation, but it also demonstrated that he knew exactly where they were and how to find them. She showed the message to Janet, who read it twice before responding. "He's scared. If he wasn't worried about what we might find tomorrow, he wouldn't be offering us an escape route. Or he's confident enough in his ability to eliminate us that he wants to give us false hope before he kills us anyway. Either way, we're not backing down now. Danny didn't get a warning before they killed him. At least we know what we're walking into." As dawn broke over Las Vegas, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, Elise and Janet prepared for what would either be the culmination of their quest for justice or the final chapter of their lives. The FBI teams were already in position around the 4 target locations, waiting for the signal to begin an operation that would determine whether 20 years of criminal conspiracy would finally face justice. In a few hours, they would have their answers. The question was whether they would live to see them. The Las Vegas facility sat in a bowl of desert 20 miles outside the city, surrounded by chain-link fencing and security cameras that swept the perimeter in endless mechanical rotations. From their position on a ridge half a mile away, Elise could see the main barn where Thunder's legacy was being held, along with the smaller buildings that housed what the FBI believed to be Castellanos' operational headquarters for the western United States. "Radio check," came Agent Chun's voice through her earpiece. "All teams report status." One by one, the tactical teams at each of the 4 locations confirmed their readiness. In California, agents were positioned around facilities in Bakersfield, Riverside, and San Diego. Here in Nevada, 12 federal agents had spent the past 6 hours moving into position around the Las Vegas compound. Target 1 reports 2 additional vehicles arrived in the past hour, came a voice from the Bakersfield team. Total of 8 personnel now visible at location. Target 3 shows elevated activity, reported Riverside. Subjects appear to be moving equipment, possibly preparing to relocate. Elise felt her heart racing as the reports came in. Castellanos' people were clearly preparing for something, whether it was a fight or an evacuation. Either way, it suggested they knew the FBI was closing in. "All teams, we initiate in 30 seconds, Chun announced. "Remember, priority is preservation of evidence and protection of our civilian specialists." Elise checked her body armor one final time and made sure The specimen containers in her veterinary kit were secure. Beside her, Janet was reviewing the photographs of the access codes they expected to find, memorizing the format so she can help identify the correct artifact quickly. "Whatever happens in there," Janet said quietly, "I want you to know that. Working with you on this has been the most important thing I've ever done. Danny would be proud of both of us." "He is proud of both of us," Elise replied. "And in about 10 minutes, his killers are going to finally face justice. Go, 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 go." Chun's voice crackled through their earpieces, and suddenly the night erupted into controlled chaos. Flashlights pierced the darkness as tactical teams moved toward their targets from multiple directions. At the Las Vegas facility, Elise could see figures running between the buildings, some carrying what appeared to be weapons. "Contact! We have armed resistance at Target 4. Came a voice from the San Diego team. "Copy that." "Target 2 team, what's your status?" "Secured. No resistance encountered. Beginning search for the target animal." Elise and Janet moved forward, with their escort team staying low and following the predetermined route toward the main barn. The facility's security lighting had been disabled in the first moments of the assault, leaving them dependent on night vision equipment and tactical flashlights. "Building clear," shouted one of the agents ahead of them. "Target animal located." They entered the barn to find Thunder's Legacy in a stall at the far end. A magnificent black stallion who was clearly agitated by the noise and activity around him. But what caught Elise's attention immediately was the presence of 3 men in expensive suits standing near the horse, their hands raised in surrender as FBI agents kept weapons trained on them. One of the men was Richard Castellanos himself, looking far less distinguished than he had in the surveillance photographs. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive clothes rumpled, and his face bore the expression of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Dr. Warren," he said as she approached the stall, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and resignation. "I have to admire your persistence. You've accomplished in 3 weeks what federal investigators have been trying to do for years. Where are the access codes?" She asked directly, having no interest in conversation with the man ultimately responsible for Danny Morrison's death. "Embedded in his left ear canal, just like the others. Though I suspect you already knew that." Castellanos gestured toward Thunder's Legacy. 20 years of careful planning, and it all comes down to what a veterinarian can find inside a horse's ear. Elise began her examination while agents secured the scene around them. Thunder's Legacy was nervous, but cooperative, perhaps sensing that the humans around him meant him no harm. Within minutes, she had located and extracted the artifact. They'd come for a small device that looked more sophisticated than the simple metal fragments they'd found in the other horses. "It's digital," she announced, holding up what appeared to be a micro USB drive sealed in protective casing. "This isn't just account numbers, it's an encrypted storage device." Agent Chun examined the device under his flashlight. This could contain terabytes of financial records, communications, maybe even video evidence of criminal activities. "Target 1 reports successful recovery," came a voice through their earpieces. "Target 3 also successful. Target 2 is still searching." "We got him," Janet said, staring at Castellanos as agents placed him under arrest. "We actually got him." But as they prepared to leave the facility, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Castellanos had surrendered too easily, had seemed almost relieved to be caught. For a man who'd spent decades building a criminal empire, his acceptance of defeat felt suspicious. "Agent Chun," she said quietly, "why do I get the feeling this was too easy?" Chun was about to respond when his radio crackled with urgent communication from the San Diego team. "Target 4 reports negative on target animal. Horse is not at this location. Repeat, Thunder's Legacy is not here." Elise felt ice water running through her veins as she looked at the horse they'd just examined, then at Castellanos' face, which now bore a slight smile. "Which horse did we just examine?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Not Thunder's Legacy," Castellanos said softly. "Thunder's Legacy has been dead for 6 months. That's Lightning Shadow, a horse whose only value is the wild goose chase he's been leading you on." The device in Elise's hand suddenly felt like a time bomb, and she realized they'd walked directly into the trap Castellanos had been setting for weeks. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Everything they'd been working toward, every risk they'd taken, had been orchestrated by the very man they were trying to bring down. Castellanos had used their investigation to eliminate loose ends, while leading them away from the real evidence. "The USB device," Agent Chun said grimly. "What's really on it?" Castellanos' smile widened. "A virus designed to infiltrate FBI financial crimes databases. The moment you plug that into any federal computer system, my associates will have access to every ongoing investigation, every protected witness, every piece of evidence you've gathered against criminal organizations across the country." Chun immediately signaled for the hazmat team to contain the device, but the damage to their investigation was already done. They'd been chasing shadows while the real Thunder's Legacy and the genuine access codes remained hidden. "Where is the real horse?" Janet demanded, her voice tight with anger at being manipulated. "Gone. Moved to a location you'll never find. Carrying information that will ensure my organization survives, even if I don't." Castellanos looked directly at Elise. "Your uncle was a good man. Dr. Warren. Weak, but good. I almost regret that his death was necessary to complete this operation." "Uncle Thomas died of a heart attack," Elise said, though even as she spoke, she realized how naive that sounded. "Uncle Thomas died of a precisely administered dose of digitalis that mimicked the symptoms of cardiac arrest. We needed him gone before he could reveal the location of certain offshore accounts, and we needed his death to appear natural." Castellanos shrugged. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. The casual admission of another murder sent rage coursing through Elise's veins. Not only had this man orchestrated Danny Morrison's death, but he'd also killed the uncle she'd loved and trusted, making it look like natural causes to avoid investigation. "How many people have you killed?" Janet asked. "Fewer than you might think. More than I care to count." Castellanos gestured around the barn. "This entire operation, the horses, the artifacts, leading you through weeks of investigation, was designed to accomplish 2 goals. First, to identify and eliminate the remaining evidence from the original Warren Stables operation. Second, to infiltrate federal law enforcement databases so we could stay ahead of future investigations. But we stopped you," Chun pointed out. "The device never made it into our systems. You stopped this attempt, but you've also revealed the extent of federal knowledge about our operations, the identity of cooperating witnesses, and the methods you use for financial crimes investigation." Castellanos looked remarkably calm for someone facing life in prison. "My associates have been monitoring your communications for weeks. They know everything you know." The implications were staggering. If Castellanos' people had been intercepting FBI communications, they would know about other ongoing investigations, other witnesses who might be in danger, other operations that were now compromised. "William Cross," Elise said suddenly. "Is he really dying?" "Cross is already dead. Has been for 3 months. We've been using an impersonator to feed you information and guide your investigation." Castellanos checked his watch. "About now, Federal. Agents are probably discovering his body in the abandoned warehouse where we've been staging your meetings." Agent Chun was already speaking urgently into his radio, coordinating with teams across multiple states to secure witnesses and protect ongoing operations that might have been compromised. But Elise could see the frustration in his eyes. They'd won the battle, but potentially lost the war. "There's one thing you didn't count on," Janet said, her voice steady despite everything they'd learned. "And what's that, Miss Morrison?" "You told us where Danny's body is buried. That wasn't part of your manipulation. That was William Cross, the real William Cross, trying to make amends before you killed him." Janet stepped closer to the man who'd orchestrated her brother's murder. "Even if you escape justice for everything else, you're going to face trial for Danny's death. And I'm going to be in that courtroom every single day, watching you pay for what you did to my family." For the first time since they'd encountered him, Castellanos' composure cracked slightly. "Your brother's death was regrettable but necessary." Thomas Warren was becoming unstable, and the boy was asking too many questions. Sometimes collateral damage is unavoidable in complex operations. Danny wasn't collateral damage. He was a 17-year-old kid with dreams and plans and people who loved him. Janet's voice grew stronger. "And his death led us to you, led us to this moment where your criminal empire finally faces justice. You haven't won anything," Castellanos said. "You've simply participated in a larger game whose rules you never understood." But as federal agents led him away in handcuffs as the facility was secured and evidence was cataloged, Elise realized that they had won something important. They'd found the truth about Danny Morrison's death, exposed a network of criminals who'd operated with impunity for decades, and ensured that Danny's killer would finally face trial. The fact that Castellanos had manipulated their investigation didn't diminish the justice they'd achieved. It simply demonstrated how desperate he'd become to protect his operation. Sometimes, Elise reflected, even being used as a pawn in someone else's game could lead to the right outcome, as long as you never stop fighting for what you believed was right. 6 months later, Elise stood in the Millbrook cemetery on a crisp April morning, watching as Danny Morrison's remains were finally laid to rest beside his parents. The headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and the inscription Janet had chosen. He sought the truth and found it. The trial had lasted 3 months and dominated headlines across the country. Richard Castellanos was convicted on 17 counts including murder, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering. The judge had sentenced him to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, noting that his crimes betrayed the basic trust that allows civilized society to function. But more importantly for Janet, the trial had officially cleared Thomas Warren's name. Evidence presented during the proceedings showed that he'd been coerced into participating in the money laundering operation and had killed Danny Morrison. In a moment of panic, rather than as part of a premeditated plan, the judge had acknowledged that Thomas was both perpetrator and victim, a man whose grief over his wife's murder had been weaponized against him by criminals who understood how to exploit human weakness. "I keep thinking about Uncle Thomas," Elise said, as she and Janet walked slowly through the cemetery after the service, "wondering if there was something I could have done to help him. Some way I could have seen what was happening." "You were 18 years old," Janet reminded her gently, "and Thomas was an adult who made a terrible choice under impossible circumstances. You can't take responsibility for decisions other people made." They paused beside Aunt Margaret's grave, where Elise had placed fresh flowers earlier that morning. The investigation had revealed that Margaret Warren had discovered irregularities in the stable's books and had been planning to contact the authorities when she was killed. Her death had been made to look like an accident, and Thomas had never suspected the truth until Castellanos' people revealed it years later as leverage to ensure his cooperation. "At least they're together now," Elise said, reading the inscription on Margaret's headstone. "And at least the truth is finally known." The aftermath of the investigation had brought unexpected closure to dozens of other families. The financial Records recovered from various horses had led to the identification of victims across multiple states and several countries. Money that had been stolen or extorted was being returned to rightful owners. People who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances were being officially declared victims of homicide, giving their families the answers they'd sought for years. Agent Chun had been promoted to head the FBI's new Financial Crimes Task Force, a position created specifically to handle complex international money laundering operations like the one they'd exposed. He'd told them that their investigation had led to the arrest of 43 people across 6 countries and the recovery of over $300 million in criminal proceeds. But for Elise and Janet, the most important outcome was much simpler. Danny Morrison, who's finally home. Sarah Chun from Sunset Farm had been at the funeral service, along with Jennifer Walsh from the Therapeutic Riding Center and several other people whose lives had been touched by the investigation. What had started with a single horse shaking his head had rippled outward to affect dozens of lives and bring justice to victims across decades. What happens now? Janet asked as they reached the cemetery gate. Now we go back to our regular lives. Elise said, I have a veterinary practice to run, and you have patients who need you at the hospital. Do you think we can do that? Just go back to normal after everything we've been through? Elise considered the question as they got into her truck. Over the past months, she discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed, had faced dangers she'd never imagined confronting, and had found a kind of purpose that went beyond the daily routine of treating sick animals. I think normal looks different now, she said finally. But I think that's okay. We've learned that we're capable of more than we thought, that we can fight for justice even when it's dangerous, that some things are worth risking everything for. Janet nodded, pulling the small metal fragment from her purse, the original artifact that had started their entire investigation. She'd kept it as a reminder of how small discoveries could lead to enormous consequences. Danny would be proud of us, she said, not just for solving his case, but for everything else we accomplished along the way. As they drove through Millbrook's quiet streets, Elise reflected on how much had changed since that October morning when Jasper, the horse, had walked into her clinic with a mysterious object lodged in his ear. The town looked the same, but she saw it differently now, not as a place to hide from the complexities of the world, but as a community worth protecting and a home worth fighting for. Her phone rang as they pulled into the clinic parking lot. The caller ID showed Maria Santos, her assistant, who's supposed to be on vacation this week. Dr. Warren? I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a situation here that I think you need to know about. What kind of situation? A woman just brought in a rescue horse from Nevada. Says the animal won't stop pawing at the ground with his right front hoof. Like there's something bothering him. She mentioned that the horse came from an estate sale, and she's worried about some kind of injury or foreign object. Elise and Janet exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. The investigation was supposed to be over, but apparently the network's legacy was still surfacing in unexpected places. Tell her I'll be there in 10 minutes, Elise said. Some stories never really end, she realized. They just become part of who you are, shaping how you respond to the next challenge that comes your way. And sometimes, when you've learned to look carefully at what others might dismiss as routine problems, you discover that the most ordinary situations can hide the most extraordinary secrets. The truth, once you start seeking it, has a way of continuing to reveal itself in the most unexpected places.